already gone by. So happy to have you join us, and we'll figure this out. Hopefully, other people will be able to join in on the fun. Brian and I were already, like, in prepping for this, having a super fun discussion on this movie. This is one of those movies that it's more fun the more conversation you have about it. The more you think about it, I think the more delicious it becomes. Um, uh, for the sake of the later audience, I'm Jin Cho. I get to help lead our diocesan office for racial diversity and justice. And this is my friend Brian Howell, who teaches anthropology at Wheaton College. Brian, tell us something interesting.
Yeah. Uh, um, there are animals that only live for a day and have no mouth. That's interesting. And about me, I've been at Wheaton 23 years, and I actually teach a class called Anthropology through Film. I love using film as a kind of window into other people's worlds and lives. And so have kind of made this a piece of my, not exactly research, but definitely a part of my sort of professional life.
Cool. Even though he does teach a class on anthropology and film and movies for a living, this is a friendly conversation. So imagine
Yes.
this as a
I'm not
movie
grading you, not
discussion.
partially anyway.
Nobody's getting graded. We have no expert level knowledge. This is a movie conversation that we invite everybody to join in on, and so participate however you want. So, quick rationale for why we do movie discussions. In one part, because simply we like movies, and certain movies like this are better when you talk about it. But the other part is because movies are the de facto vehicle for telling our modern mythologies, especially American mythologies. I think the vehicle of film cinema is probably the most widely used way for people to understand what it is that we believe in as a culture, that the values that drive us. And even more specifically for our work in race and justice, movies, I think, help us to see things that are often from an often unfamiliar perspective. And I think this movie definitely does that and brings to light stories that we might not have access to unless we have somebody thoughtful like this taking us by the hand and guiding us through it. So that's our rationale. Our movie today, as we all know, is Past Lives. Is it a romance? Is it a coming of age story? Is it a what if story? Quickly, how would you describe this movie in a sentence or less to your friends? Brian, I'm going to put you on the spot, but I'm going to ask everybody to kind of chime in. A sentence or less. A sentence or less, yeah.
My sentence might have a bunch of semicolons in it. I don't know. Uh, it's a what if film that asks deep questions about who our true self is.
I like that. Okay. Carrie, any thoughts?
In a sentence?
Just to a friend.
Right.
Just to a friend. Yeah.
I think what I walked away with is really didn't come home to me till the last scene, but what does it mean? What does it feel like to finally leave your childhood behind?
I like that. Okay. Justin or Todd?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a total romance movie, personally, but I think the deeper issue is, what are these, true to the title, what does it mean to be an immigrant and to have a past life? So that's what I took away from it.
Like that. Todd, you seem a little lost in thought, or you got a good one?
Yeah, well, I mean, you guys have really said some good things. The immediate thing that came to my mind was I texted a few people in my congregation inviting them to this, and I just wrote, and I think I was doing a little marketing here, so this isn't philosophical, but I was saying it's an achingly sweet movie about childhood sweethearts separated by immigration. So that's
Mm,
almost like a movie subtitle, you know.
Yeah, yeah.
But there was something aching about it. I mean, I think the whole movie I was aching.
yeah.
Yes,
So
that's
there's
good.
something heartbreaking, something to do with separation. Doesn't have to be just on a romantic level, on a national level, an ethnic level. Yeah, it hurt. It was a sweet hurt existentially for me.
Yeah, all really good stuff. Um, what is it about this movie? I'm just gonna get us started with like Brian, just asking Brian a bunch of questions while people get warmed up a little bit, while I pepper him but please feel free to jump in. This I don't want to put people on the spot, except for we agreed to put each other on spot. So
Yeah.
this is sort of how we're driving this conversation. But what is it, Brian? Tell me a little bit about the what ifs and why you started off describing that as a what if story. What did you identify with about the what if part?
So, so the movie goes through these time jumps, right? And it shows us, these people at various points in their lives, and then it'll go back, and then it'll go forward, and it is laying out this idea of, what these choices that were made for them, So she was taken to Canada, not on her own volition. He chose to go to China to study Chinese, and then take that separation where he wasn't communicating with her for that time. That these choices that were made or that they were making had these, then it showed up in the next jump, right? So then they're 12 years later, and it's like, oh, well, that's because of this choice that was made. And so it seemed like these sort of series of little branching moments, and it's like once you branch one way, then it's like the other thing vanishes, it's gone, right? And but then the questions are asked at these later stages. Well, like, what if we'd taken the other branch? What if we'd gone this way? And what would that have been like? And who would I be? And her thing about, being with him, and he's so Korean, and it makes me feel more Korean, but also less Korean. And I can't really understand him, but I totally understand him. Like that sense of she left her Koreanness in a way that he didn't. And so now they're just in these different places, and yet they can remember the connection of that branch that they
Yeah,
had at that one point. And so they can't have, and then of course her white husband is like, do you wish you'd stayed there? Would you be happier with that? He's kind of hinting around this idea of like, oh, well, did you make the wrong choice? And of course, it wasn't even her choice. So anyway, I just feel like there's all this questioning, either explicitly or implicitly. Are we in the right place? Did we do the right thing? Should we have done this earlier? Should we have, what if I had never reached out? What if I hadn't gone looking for you on the internet? All those little what ifs that show up and say, oh man, our lives are just these
yeah.
series of little decisions that send us these certain directions.
And it's like one of these things that we do, at least I do in my head sometimes. Like I find myself in some of my moments thinking, what if I had done this? What if I decided to go and do this major? What if I decided to go to this school? What if I decided to take this job? And then you also mentioned in our pre-conversation that this is actually a conversation that husbands and wives actually have with one another about at different point in our lives, talking about just kind of like, would you have done this? Or even like childhood loves. It's like, well, what if you married him? That sort of a thing. That's sort of kind of like a playful conversation. And they're having this conversation in their bedroom, Nora and Arthur, and it draws us into it. And it's this movie. It's like, what makes us us? Are we where we are because of our choices? or are we where we are because somebody else had, because of fate or just because of circumstances? And what does it mean to be here in the present? And I think it asks those questions and it gives us some possibilities for answers.
I just threw, it made me think, what you said made me think, I just threw something in the chat, a link to a book I read several years ago by an MIT professor called Midlife, A Philosopher's Guide. And of course, that was when I don't think I'm midlife anymore for sure, but he made the point somewhere in that book that this is the kind of thing. Now, of course, these characters aren't at midlife, but they're kind of experiencing it early. He made the point that that's what we often do is we go back and wonder like, gosh, if I'd taken this stream, I could have had this, or I could have had that. He says what we often fail to do is if we're going to go on that thought experiment, we have to then release everything we've gained in the stream that we've chosen. So, you know, I mean, the classic thing nobody wants to talk about is what if I'd married that person instead of this person? Well, then you have to let go of all the good things. You have to let go of your children in the thought experiment. You have to let go of all the relationships that that particular marriage introduced you to. You'd have to let go of where you live right now. And so we tend to long for the other thing, but we don't. It's basically regret versus gratitude, right? And to regret, but we fail to be grateful for what this stream gave us. And the question is, would I be willing to give up this stream? Because I can't have them both. Anyway, he identified this as a midlife kind of fantasy that occurs to people when they're in some way dissatisfied with their current stream or aspects of it.
In some ways, I feel like this movie are those very questions, right? So it's working some of those things out. Justin,
Yeah,
what do you think?
just to kind of continue on that mode of thought, two of my favorite moments in the movie was when the Korean man says to his childhood, friend, I didn't realize how hard it would be for me to like your husband. I don't know if you remember that. I'm not really doing it justice, but it's a really interesting moment. And I think it's this kind of resignation to a greater ordering of their lives. And then my other favorite part is at the very end when she finally grieves with her husband and is crying there at the footsteps or the stairs to their apartment. And I think about, and Jen, you can like totally mute me if you think this is wrong, but I'm mindful this week of Ascension Day, which is Thursday. This idea that Jesus is ruling and reigning on high above everything. And I feel like, not to over spiritualize a movie that maybe wasn't intended to be, but I like the idea of thinking about how God is Lord of all, including my choices and my non-choices. And what I liked about those moments in the movie was part of kind of yielding to God is maybe realizing that there's, like he says, I like your husband. I didn't realize how hard it would be to like your husband. Like it's okay to like or to see the wisdom of God's bigger plan, even if it sometimes costs us, right? So anyways, those are my thoughts.
Yeah, I
That's
think
good.
that idea of it costing something, to your point, Todd, about how this is an aching film and it has this, sort of bittersweet quality to it. The metaphor of past lives is about kind of reincarnation and the lives that we had, that lives we would have died from, right? Like lives that we lived and then died and then came back. And so I think it's meant to sort of have this idea that like your choices cause a death of a sort. You know, you have to let this one dream die in order to have this other one, and they can't live together. And there is something about Hae-sung sort of seeing that and being like, oh, you have good, this is good what you have here, and this shouldn't die. This shouldn't die so that you can have something else. This other thing had to die, and so that you could have this. And so it's hard for me to sort of reconcile that you, yeah, that it was okay that this thing that we had died.
Carrie, what do you I feel like you got something that's percolating.
Well, kind of just so many things. I think this film, it touched me from a number of different points. I suppose the one I'm ruminating on at the moment is just sort of the larger issue of moving cross-culturally and living cross-culturally, and having done that a number of times myself, and having taken my adolescent children to do that a number of times. And I'm just very struck with the I twice pulled my daughter out of young love relationships in order to move to our next place. And I feel the pain of that all over again. And it's kind of, she's now happily married, which is wonderful. But yeah, so it was an opportunity for me to revisit some of those choices in our life and the costs that they have come for my people. I also, there wasn't, it didn't really get addressed. I thought there was an interesting little reality that Nora became an artist, and both of her parents had been makers of art. And then she makes reference to being in conversation with her mother, but not her father. And I noticed that. I did a little bit of reading on the film to realize that it is somewhat autobiographical for the filmmaker. So maybe that's part of that. But that just was interesting to me. I think that the bringing up of reincarnation as a motif for the film, and different ways that different cultures grapple with that idea, is interesting. In our tradition, we maybe closely grapple with it in sort of how the sins of the generations past are on us as well. And I guess I just kind of started going down that bunny trail a little bit. Like, what did it cost the generations of their family to leave their culture in which they had been making art, and for her to come into really two or three different cultures and continue to make art. There's a lot of fuel, I think, in that. And I don't know, I just got wondering about that.
That's great. Let's talk about that a little bit more. Let's talk about that because they bring it up a couple of times. Inyan, and I think the way they translate it is this sense of possibly fate, but sense of more of a connection that you might feel that is deeper than that is reflective of the present moment. That something you feel a depth or familiarity with someone or something even that tells perhaps, or that is reflective of a deeper history. That connection connected to how we navigate this life. What did you think about that? How would you translate that? And what is that? What I'm trying to understand is, what is that bringing out about the human experience for you?
Just a point of clarification, what I recall from I not known the concept before. They talked about layers, right? Something like 7,000 layers. I mean, obviously that's kind of a metaphor. Is that what I remember? That there's a layering, that if you're
I
in
think
yun
it's
with someone, you have, can somebody help me recall how they described it? I
I
mean, it
think
was fate, obviously fate, but they
yeah,
talked
I think
yeah.
about,
I think the 8,000 layers is particular to marriage, whereas Inyan was a more
I see.
uh, an experience that people could have irrespective of marriage. I could have that wrong.
And I think if it is connected to the Buddhist idea of reincarnation, that we've been through many lives
Mhm.
in which we've had connections, and this is why we're feeling a deeper connection with somebody that we might just walk across the street. And I think all of us can say that it's like, yeah, all of a sudden I met somebody, that sort of this idea that I met someone that I felt like I knew them all my life,
Yeah.
even though I just met them for the first time. And it's trying to give voice to that sort of an experience. I think a depth that transcends that moment or the actual lived history that you may be aware of. And that may possibly, and I think it also talks about a possible future as well. So we were talking about this in the context of this movie is very much a multiverse movie, and much like so many other multiverse movies, except it is talked about, and that makes me realize, oh, those multiverse movies are actually meaningful, and it's not a new concept, but it's something that has been there, that talks about if we made different choices, or what is my history of history that gets me to my present.
Yeah, I
And
wonder,
there's, oh,
go
go
ahead.
ahead.
No, please,
No,
Brian, I want to hear what you say.
All right. Well, this question of who are you? What is the self that can maybe be in all these different places? So like the movie Everything Everywhere All at Once was like you have a core self that then can be in these different places depending on sort of the choices that are made around you and the way that the universe sort of directs you off to these different things. I think Past Lives is saying like you have different selves. Like there are different selves that exist in different times and places. And the yin yang concept is like, yeah, reincarnated lives, but the movie sort of shows just like the different lives that you live in the course of one life and how you are kind of a different self. So this is Nora when she's talking about that Korean self of that I was like, I can't quite be her anymore. And at the same time, Arthur is like, there's a part of you that I can't get to that's like a different you than the one that I know. It's the one that speaks Korean. It's the one that, lives in this other place. And even, when they were coming back from Canada and there's that moment where they're crossing the border and they're with the border guard guy. And it's like they're leaving the Toronto life, that self that, we don't even see that family much. We just see her for that 1 minute, standing against the wall, listening to all these Canadian kids, talking, and her obviously feeling really disconnected from it, but also clearly looking to figure out like, how am I going to be part of this? And I think that idea of like the Western self is this really stable, autonomous, find your true self and be yourself and, follow your heart, that kind of thing. And I think in a lot of other cultures, the idea that the self is really created in relationship and it's really created in the context where you find yourself, and it's malleable and shifting and multiple. And I think that comes out in this film in this really profound way. And like Todd, you said, in a kind of aching way, because it's like, well, you can't be all the selves. Some of them have to end.
I think that the conversation that we were talking about earlier, where they're lying in bed and Nora, I feel like that conversation read to me like Arthur's saying, I chose you and this relationship. And she's saying, I chose it too, but I chose it because it happened to me. And for her, it was sort of a journey of happenings that she chose to embrace. And that, you know, to me, that, I mean, we could read that scene as gendered or east west, or we could read that scene a lot of different ways. I thought it was lovely, and my husband and I had a really interesting conversation about that, because yeah, I think there's certain aspects of our relationship that mirror that, where, you know, he was like, I'm just sure, and I was more like, I'm reading the tea leaves and watching the crumbs that God has dropped that has brought me to you, and I choose the whole thing. So just different ways of understanding choosing were interesting to me in that scene in particular.
I think that's a great point.
Thing. I think it's interesting that she chose another artist and that she sort of unchose her engineer childhood friend in a romantic way. There's a dynamic there too.
I think that sort of that different idea of choice, that our life is where we are, not necessarily because of choice, because like so much of the Western identity is formed on the ability to choose well. And but I think this movie gives voice to the reality that perhaps that's not the only way to think about what forms us and how we become, what it means to be courageous in our moment,
Yeah.
to be fully committed to the moment, because she is an artist who her choices are based on who she is. She's fully committed. She wants to be committed to the moment, even to her detriment, even when it goes against her heart. So I found that really, really interesting, taking me to really interesting places.
And you know, connected to the art, it did strike me that her choices were initially vocational, in a very kind of that herself wrapped around this. You know, first we get the Nobel Prize and the Pulitzer Prize and the Tony Award as the kind of the, as she gets to know more about who she is, she turns out to be a dramatist, right? So um and that becomes the controlling paradigm for herself when she moves to North America. You know, that's the North American way, is you, some of you already said, kind of the realization of my potential, which is wrapped up basically in my career for many people, many of us. Whereas he, you know, he was almost apologetic about his engineering. It was almost like, I live an ordinary life. I'm an ordinary person, I think he said. And is that a cultural thing that I remember a Dutch, actually, Tim Blackman from Wheaton, I remember actually, you know, telling me about his Dutch upbringing. And he says in the Netherlands, you don't want to be too explicitly ambitious, because you're saying, I'm better than other people. You know, you don't want to say, you don't want to indicate that, you know, I'm better than other people. I wonder if that's something that was a play there. But in any event, it seems like she collapsed herself into this vocational self and got together with somebody with similar ambitions. But what did she give up? Was there almost a deeper metaphysical, you know, self, the whole ancestry, reincarnation, almost larger self? Is that what she's mourning and grieving? Do we see that as a move from something more relational and fuller to something more vocational and narrower? Yeah, so I'm curious about both the cultural notions of vocation, career, and how that we identify that with the self or don't.
Yeah. And in fact, that was something that I was able to. So this was really interesting, because the movie, because the Korean that was spoken very slowly, and I don't know if you noticed that even in the translation. And so generally, I often have the subtitles on so that I can understand. I speak Korean, but not well at an adult conversation level that I missed the nuances, but I was able to catch nearly all of these conversations, and I could almost turn off the subtitles or not look at the subtitles and just kind of like listen. And there was so much to it where it was so obvious to me. So when Haesung was asked, why did you break up with your girlfriend? If you remember that conversation when they meet for the first time and they're at a park, his reply wasn't like, oh, we didn't, we had issues or whatever. He says, I'm an only child, talking about his place and responsibilities. She needed somebody else with certain other, he felt that she should have somebody better or so. So that was like a completely not a thing about personal choice, but about the choices of a culture and familial obligations. And so there is a very different way of making choice, that he doesn't make the choice, but that's part of his understanding of what it means to make a choice, even for something as personal as who do you marry?
That's so
Yeah.
interesting, Jin, because when you hold that against that sort of side by side, that early scene where the mother is taking Nora to have the date.
Yeah.
And she sort of says, why have you done this if you're moving? And she said, well, I sort of wanted to show my daughter a good time, which is really not what that surprised me so much, because that it was almost as if she had already turned her face to their coming life. I don't know. I don't know if anybody else thought that was an interesting moment.
That's a really interesting detail that you caught, I think. Yeah.
It seemed out of place to me, and yeah, so
I'm curious about the two moms at the beginning when they're watching the kids play, and um, I wonder if there was a sense of I guess there was that question like, why are you immigrating? Um, but I'm curious about that dynamic, between families who are maybe friends, and one family decides to immigrate. I find that dynamic really interesting and somewhat disturbing.
What describe a little bit more. What do you mean disturbing? What was disruptive for you?
Well, I got the impression that, it was one mom was excited that their kids were together and because they liked each other. And then being that the reason why the other mom was doing it was so that her daughter would have good memories of Korea, right? Um, which I found to be like a total abuse of that relationship. But maybe I'm misreading it.
mm.
Any thoughts on that possible? Um, I'm gonna speak as an immigrant because I can. Before we came to the US, like one of the things that we did was, and this was very early on, we toured the country. Like we visited all the places, and I feel like in some ways what they were doing, my parents were doing, as well as what this mother was doing in one sense, in a very different way, is to try to say, we're going to leave this homeland, but we want you to have an attachment.
Yeah.
We want you to appreciate this place. I do think it was interesting that Carrie said like, oh, I'm gonna make sure that you have somebody. Maybe that's a connection that she was going for. And there was a weird thing of like, I think also in terms of like she was an artist, right? That you could kind of see it in the two Korean women. They were sitting side by side. One was very westernized, one was very Korean. even in the way they were sitting. And that's one of the things that I picked up on. But yeah, the immigrant experience of that, and then coming, because that rationale of why do we, for them, they had the luxury of pursuing for their sake of their ambition, right? They were ambitious, a family. Um, uh, that's not always the case. That's not the typical immigrant story, but that plays into it. And then the other part of this conversation that I was telling Brian about in the pre-conversation is, man, I could not help but see this movie in terms of like those two lives that happen, and that bifurcation of your identity that happens pre and post this cultural experience. Like, so even now, I was sharing, I think differently in Korean versus in English, and it taps different parts of my mind, and but they don't know how to be together.
Yeah.
Like, I feel like I don't know how to be both. And so sometimes I could understand things from a Korean perspective, but experience it as uh, the American Asian that I am. So that sort of like struggling with identity within oneself, I really related with that sense of like, how do I put these two parts together? I don't know. You just kind of live. That was, I thought, really powerful.
Yeah.
You know, and another what you were saying a minute ago about what you all were saying about the decision to immigrate when when the children are children. I wonder if there's a political subtext, and I may really be straining, but I do remember seeing something about anti-American sentiment in Korea in the 90s. I think this film was about to set the kid. I think the kids are kids about then or something,
Yeah, yeah.
and that there was a resistance on the part of Korea to admit Hollywood films
Mm.
as part of the anti-American sentiment. So it may be. I mean, it's very unspoken, right? I mean, he's leaving, even though someone said, "Oh, you have a good job here.
Mm-hmm.
Your dad has a good, your husband has a good job here in Korea, filmmaker." And but it seems like there was some opportunities not available to him as a filmmaker. So already, as you said, you have the pursuit of art, and I wonder if there was a political, um, it's probably not uh, foregrounded enough to make it a major theme of the film, but it does seem to coincide with that period where Hollywood distribution was not freely allowed in Korea, and so this guy's um, going with his family to America.
Well, what's interesting is that they actually go to Canada, right? Like they
Canada,
actually
right?
go to Toronto, which is the capital of film production in Canada. And then she
Hmm.
immigrates from Canada to the United States. And so
That's it.
she
Yeah.
double immigrates and leaves them in their country, which is now
Hmm.
Canada. So there's a kind of double leaving,
Hmm.
you know, with the immigration story.
Hmm.
Mm.
Let's bring this to toward the last, or the bar scene, or toward the very end,
Mm.
which is also the very beginning. It's the first scene,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
So
that's cool.
which
That's
was
very cool.
right. And it's kind of, that first scene really sets the stage for all of the things, all the bits and pieces, as we go into kind of like, it's like a mystery, right? So it's, there's a voyeuristic quality to this movie as well, right? So you feel like you're kind of peeking in, and it starts off like that. Um, uh, that conversation is uh, I would love your thoughts on that conversation, because it is also the most personal, and yet it's happening right in front of the husband. How did you receive that? How did you feel about that? It's like, so it draws you in, and yet it's so um it is so out of the blue in one sense, right? Because it's so direct, and yet it is also it's so direct and so public.
Yeah.
Yeah, and why are the conditions right for that there?
Yeah,
They're in a bar.
yeah,
It seems like the worst possible
yeah,
place
yeah.
with the husband there in a bar. Anyway, good question.
Yeah. 11th hour. Oh.
I mean, I couldn't help but, feel for the white husband in that moment, just because, I've been in situations like that where somebody's supposed to translate, and it's obvious that they're not translating everything in the first place. And then pretty soon the translation just kind of stops and the conversation's just happening. And you can't jump in and be like, what was that? What did you say? So you just kind of like fade, and you just, and then of course the camera does that. It like cuts him out and it just focuses on the two as they're having their conversation and they're talking about him. Finally, she turns around and she's like, he's talking about you, and I know that the husband is like, I thought so, the whole time. But there's just, I don't know, I think it just so dramatizes like the separateness of these worlds, and just how she can't really bridge them. She kind of has to
Mm,
be in one or the other. And there's not really a self of hers that really exists in both places. And so for a minute, she chooses just to be with Haesung, and then it's not till she goes back and joins Arthur again and cries on his shoulder that she's like, okay, back
Yeah.
there.
Hmm.
I'm taken by just the role of Arthur, the husband, just how that could have been such a caricature, but it was so well done, and both sad, and yet at the same, and he was jealous, but he wasn't necessarily a hero, but he was a decent man who was there, and I thought it was so well done. Yeah.
When we were watching it, maybe I don't know exactly at what point this shifted, but at some point my husband and I said, we're not loving him yet, meaning Arthur. Like we were not endeared toward him yet. And we knew that we were probably going to need to be, and that wasn't happening yet. Whereas totally endeared towards Nora and Haesung from the first minute, right? And
Mm.
so, but it was interesting because there was this instant in which that changes. And I agree. I thought he was terrifically played, Arthur. I love, oh, that line, did you not laugh out loud when she said, you, yes, Arthur Podorowski, you are my immigrant parents' dream come true.
Yes.
Just an awesome
Yes.
self-revealing kind of line. It's so transparent. I love that. I just, so what's in the back of my head, I've told you I raised my kids abroad. My kids are third culture kids, and both of them have chosen white American partners who have never been passport holders and have never traveled out of their home state. And I just think that is so surprising. But I don't know if it's the same kind of thing of it's you can be TCK kid or you can be American kid, but how to blend those two is very challenging. I feel like it's kind of the same thing that we're observing in this film.
Mm. That's a great connection. Todd,
I
what
didn't mean
is
to
this?
I didn't mean to publish that actually while someone else was talking. I hit return to write something else, and then of course return means it gets published. Well, this is a side. This is taking us away from the bar, but and by the way, this is from Heidegger. I have never read Heidegger, so let's be clear, I'm not really up to Heidegger. philosophically. But someone has communicated to me, probably through other books, this concept of thrownness, existential concept of thrownness that we experience. And I think I've used this in sermons too, that we experience our place in any given time as if we've been thrown into a situation. We didn't choose it. We couldn't have engineered it. We have this existential sense, right? This feeling that, like, how did I land here? This thrownness, and then notice the last bit of this, attendant with its frustrations, sufferings, demands that one does not choose, such as social convention or ties of kinship and duty. So I think the whole film reminds me of that. I mean, it's almost the opposite of fate. This idea that we are thrown into situations, but this is also a moment of freedom, which is, I guess, why the existentialists like it, right? Because existentialism is like, the burden is you have to choose, even though you've been thrown into circumstances now that you have no choice of. So that's a sidebar. I still think
that's one of my absolute favorite things about this film is the choice that they make at the end, which is to not kiss. I loved that so much because there is such a valorization in the Western movie mythology of follow your heart and, be yourself and don't let family or tradition or expectations of others interfere with your life in any way. And if you do, you're being inauthentic and it's terrible. And I was telling Jin in our little earlier conversation that this, for me, has vibes of this movie, Roman Holiday, which is this classic movie with Audrey Hepburn and Cary Grant, where she's a princess and they go around Rome all day, and he shows her this great time, and they really fall in love. And then at the end of the day, she's like, I have to leave you. I have my kingdom to think of, and my people need me, and I have to go back. And she does, and she leaves him, and he sees her in this receiving line where she's being the princess, and she just gives him the subtlest of recognizable nods and doesn't even really acknowledge him. And it's the kind of movie that just wouldn't even get made today because people would just be like, that's a bummer, man. Like, she needs to follow her heart and she needs to go out there and just be herself and not let her stupid kingdom tell her what to do. And so when they stand there forever at the Uber, and you're like, are they gonna kiss? And then they don't. I was just like, that's so un-Hollywood. That is so un-Western, un-movie to say, I'm gonna choose, this thing that I've been thrown into. Yes, we didn't really choose this moment, this lives but now we're gonna choose. And it's not this. It's we can't give up these other things. And I was just like, oh, way to go, film.
So good.
Yeah, and the beginning, as you pointed out, some pointed out, the beginning of the film, of course, is also the end of the film in terms of the bar scene. And I think what you said, Brian, earlier about this being a movie about identity, you hear the voiceovers from somebody at another booth or table trying to figure out what their relationships are.
Yeah.
And in one sense, that those are all possible scenarios. They kind of go through the scenarios. They're trying to figure out who belongs to who, whether they even belong together at all. And of course, we know that one way of defining identity is to whom do we belong, right? That's the big question of identity, is to whom do I belong? And so the movie starts with this question of who belongs to who. And they kind of run through the scenarios, and the rest of the movie, we grapple with where they belong, who they belong to, who they feel they belong to, where, so it is, as Brian said, really a question of identity.
How do we let's pretend, because we are let's pretend we're pastors and people. How do we connect this to our understanding of Christ and how we live? Like, how do we understand the lessons and the questions and the perspectives that we learn from this story? How does it challenge you? How might you what might you take away?
Well, I think I already tipped my hand a little bit there when I talked about thrownness. I mean, I think there is a and this is hard to grapple with a little bit because we always want to believe that God has a plan for our lives. Um, but sometimes Jesus resists, as in the parable of the blind man, like who sinned? You know, this man or his parents, or the blind man, you know, like well, let's figure out the narrative that got them to this point, got him to this point. And Jesus says, we're not even going to ask that question.
Yeah.
We're just going to ask about what to do next,
Yeah.
the glory of God. And so for me, the thrownness is kind of I think I've sermonized on this before that, yeah, I mean, we can sit here all the time trying to figure out, okay, why did God put me in this situation? And is it my fault? Because we want to control our narrative, right? We want to know the why behind it. We want to, you know, when, you know, with students, as you know, Brian, they go for something and they believe God spoke to me and it didn't work out. And and uh and so now they're trying to figure out, well, there must be some other reason I took that job, even though the company folded. Because they want to find the narrative, they want to find the backstory, they want control. If they can figure out what God was trying to do, then they feel like they're in control. And I think, you know, you can't always answer that question. You can't always answer the why. You can seek to answer, now that I'm here, what next? Moving forward. Now that I've thrown into this situation, you know, I met an artist in my artist in residency, and we got together, and suddenly my childhood friend contacts me, and okay, I don't know, you know, what the grand narrative is here, but I'm now like, okay, Lord, what is live in the present? What is it to walk with you in this situation into which I've been thrown? So I think that's for me kind of the takeaways, one of the takeaways.
Yeah, I think I would say something similar in terms of you know, students or all of us, you know, when we do this, like kind of trying to figure out, you know, what is God trying to teach me, or you know, what's the lesson from this, or why did this happen? What's the meaning of it? A lot of it is trying to deal with the pain of those things and try to like have no pain associated with like it was actually a good thing that this happened, or there's, you know, this purpose in it, and it's important that this thing happened for this reason. And there is pain in life. There is pain in the choices that we make and the things that we leave behind. And Jesus says, if you don't die to yourself, you can't have life with me. That you have to die to these things, you know, that you have to hate your mother and father, you have to turn away. That there is a sense in which just being a disciple is about embracing the fact that there is pain in the world and in being human. And that not everything has this sort of redemptive like story behind it, even though it does, right? Like ultimately, if we find our satisfaction in Jesus, of course, that is what we're designed for. That's what we're meant to pursue. But this world, you know, is going to bring us pain. And so when they find themselves in this situation and they just have to sort of embrace the pain of we can't be together. We're in different places, and we will go to those places and we'll live out our lives, and there will be some pain in that. And I feel like that's a very Christian understanding of, yeah, to follow what's good, which is God, means that there's going to be sort of things we can't have, longings that won't get fulfilled, and ways in which we will have to die to self. And it's not a easy thing, and it wasn't supposed to be.
That's good. Justin, Carrie, guys have any
I'm
on the call?
well, I'm preaching Ascension Sunday, and so that's where my brain is. And so I'm probably trying to not, draw too strong of conclusions, but there's this hinge. I think I have to get rid of the word hinge in my sermon because that's a new dating program, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah.
But that's how I'm conceived. Like there's there's this pendulum, there's this looking from one window to another between resurrection and Pentecost, and we can't get from one to the other apart from the ascension. I guess what I'm trying to say to my people is Jesus went away, and that's good news for us, and we've got to figure out how that's good news for us. And some of this conversation is how this is good news for us, because there is new life after loss of good. And that is just something we have to figure out how to be open to. I'm also counseling a young woman who's on study abroad right now, and did the proverbial, broke up with her new love before she went on study abroad. And we've talked about it the whole time she's away. And now she's coming back. And what's that going to mean? And did God ordain it this way or that? And I keep wanting to say, we will see what happens. And she just can't live with, we will see. She needs to know now. And that's just not ours.
What's that proverb? I'll probably butcher this. I think it's Chinese rather than Korean, but about is it a farmer and his son, right? And the farmer's son breaks his leg, and neighbors come over and say, "Oh, that's too bad. I'm so sorry." And he said, "We'll see." And then the army comes to conscript
Yes.
children, and then they don't conscript the boy because he has a broken leg, and the neighbor says, "Well, good news, congratulations, he didn't get conscripted." And the farm says, "We'll see." And it goes on like this. He's congratulated or grieved alternately by his neighbors, and they're saying, "This is a good thing, this is a bad thing." He's always like, "Well, we'll see." Every time it goes through 4 or 5 cycles.
One thing that I'm taking away as I was hearing everyone talk about different scenes. Remember the scene where Nora says to Arthur, "You know me,"
Yeah.
or like you trust, kind of like you would trust me with, talking with him, right? And there was kind of this moment of uncertainty. And what that reminds me of, kind of theologically, is the truth that I believe that there is our relationship with God is totally loving and totally knowing and totally ongoing, in a sense that we don't have that necessarily with one another. Or like, to go to the movie plot, the whole world of, I'm probably butchering the term, engine, that whole world that knows Nora better than even Arthur knows Nora. And there's this the reality of being known by the living God, who's totally loving and totally ongoing. I think that's part of the comfort, but also part of the pain of life. Because I know, like, just speaking personally, one of my greatest disappointments and frustrations in life is when I don't feel like others really know me or others can relate to me. But praise God that I have a Savior who does know me and who is loving and who is totally ongoing, will always be there. You know what I mean?
Well, that's great. Those are all superb insights. I think this, as I mentioned, I think this is definitely one of these movies. The more you chew on it, the more these sorts of subtle insights come from these incredibly ordinary conversations as they're getting ready for bed, brushing their teeth, just falling asleep, or getting up, walking. I think it says, for me, what I take away is this sense of the depths of our connections and the relationships that form each and every one of us. and how even these, we just can't, we don't move on. Like all of our relationships, all of our connections form us in a way that helps us to, hopefully in a way that helps us to be more present for the relationships that we have now in the present, in the moment. I thought it was really powerful in thinking about relationships that way, and just and how um well thought through to understand how we are formed like this. I think it's a different way of thinking about uh why we are the way we are, what makes us who we are, and how we come to be uh the in the places that we are. So I thought it was really powerful, and I think it really is important lesson for people who are so uncertain about so many things. And I think the nuances of these conversations, I think throughout the movie, just really helped break down some of these this gut level sense that many of us have. Is this, you know, is this like a common conversation that I can have with others? So really loved having this conversation with all of you. You guys are all fun people to hang out and chat with, and I'm glad that we were able to have this in an intimate way. Perhaps others can benefit as well, through recordings and watching. And we're going to put all of these resources up on our website once we get done. So this was a very rich conversation. Thanks to all of you for joining us and sharing very openly. So
Thank you both for hosting us.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you, Jen. Thank you, Brian.
thanks,
Super fun.
folks.
Super fun.
Absolute blast. Okay. Thank you. Take care. Have a great rest of the week.
Peace.